Hey, what's up? I'm Kirk of Effectatron, and today we're going to do a quick overview of explaining and breaking down redshift displacement because it's a pain point for a lot of people. So we're going to try to explain how it works, and on top of that, how the tessellation works within the RS object tag, because I think if once you understand what that's doing, like visually, we'll try to demonstrate that as well, and you'll actually start to really understand how it works and what kind of geometry you need for redshift. So we'll talk about that here in a second, but what we're going to do is we're going to go to polyhaven.com/textures. That way everybody can be on the same page and follow along if you like. I'll have a link for this below. These are all free PBR textures. We're going to grab one that's got some good displacement that looks good. No, just a little stretching right there and stuff. That's going to happen every now and then. That's okay, because normally, like for grounds and stuff, you're going to cover it up with grass or leaves or whatever. So keep that in mind. Okay, and you can see this comes with these textures inside, and we'll go ahead and talk about those as well. So let's go ahead and download that. Boom, boom. Okay, it's going to be a zip folder. We're going to need to extract that, and then once we extract that, we'll open up C4D and put that in there. All right, we've extracted that. These are the files we have from that. We've got some JPEGs, some PNGs, and some EXRs. Okay, so you may notice we've got AO, which is ambient occlusion. We've occlusion arm map, which is ambient occlusion, roughness, and metallic all in one, where you use a color splitter to split them. We don't need to mess with that in C4D as much, because that is more for something like a game engine like Unity or Unreal Engine 5, where the size of your scene matters. Like if you have a game and you don't want it to, when you have 100 textures, if you can reduce the file size of those textures down by having one texture map to load versus 3 texture maps to load, that starts adding up quickly. So that's why they have that in there. Okay, that's not something you really need to worry about inside of C4D, because file size isn't as big of an issue, because we're not trying to, load it onto, a system. Okay, so we have the diffusion, which is the color map, the displacement, which is what we're going to use. That's always just kind of a blurred gray height scale map, okay? And we've got normal DX, which is directional. That's good. And then we have a roughness map, which is good as well. So how do we bring these in? Hook these up really quick and then apply them inside of C4D and use the displacement very quickly and easily. Let's go ahead and set that up. All right, instead of here, we're going to go ahead and create material, standard material. Go ahead and open that up. There we go. And all we have to do is grab our textures. We want the AO, the diffuse, the displacement, the normal, and the roughness. Okay. And just click and drag those in. Boop. You can say yes or no here. It doesn't really matter too much. Yes, we'll move them to the file, move the location of them, whatever, make a copy. Okay. So you'll have to give it a second to let those previews load, because they are, 500 megabits worth of 8K images that we just brought in, and it's going to build a preview and stuff. There we go. Okay, so we got the color. Let's go ahead and hook this up into our standard material. So what I like to do when I'm hooking this up is I like to just go ahead and throw this on like a plane, just so we can kind of see it happening while we're doing it. And we'll go ahead and throw just a redshift sun and sky on here just to give it something. Okay, and we'll go ahead and turn on the IPR. Cool. Now, let's go ahead and grab the diffuse. That goes to the base color. The roughness map here. Roughness map goes into roughness. The AO map, some people are confused where this goes. This goes into like the main thing. You click this, and then you say geometry. It's right here at the top. Overall tint, and that's how that works. And what AO is going to do is basically it's going to just kind of fake some extra shadow in the nooks and crannies of our object, which is going to help it look more real. Normal map. So for the normal map, we hit C and type in bump. And there we go. We'll grab the bump map in. No big deal. Normal goes into that. And when you're using something like this, if you look at this map and you see it's all purple and green and stuff, it's called a normal map. That's good. What the difference between a black and white normal map or a height map for the bump map is that the blue, green, and purple and red, all those colors are directional, which means that they can fake, besides just up and down, they can fake, if the object's supposed to go out this way a little bit or out that way a little bit. So whenever you can use a purpley, bluish, green normal map over a black and white map, you're going to want to, because it's going to look a little better. But the main thing is, if we're going to focus on displacement, the normal map is going to get overshadowed by the displacement map, basically. But good to know for the future. So basically, the way this works is inside of our bump map, we have the input type. So if it's gray, black, and white, it's going to be a height field. But since this is a purple blue one, we're going to use the tangent space normal. Now you may see that we also have an object space normal. That is going to be used if the map that you have is designed for a specific object. So these are seamless tileable PBRs, so they're going to be the tangent space normal. But let's say I downloaded a robot that someone made in like Substance Painter and put a custom normal map just for that object. You're going to want to use object space normal for that. Tangent space normal, boom, good. That plugs into the bump. Nice, done. Now all we have left is displacement, and we're going to take a look at kind of what displacement is, how it works really quickly, and when to use it. Because right now we have the bump map on here, and you can see if we look at this straight on from a distance, that wouldn't look terrible, right? We can take our light, and this is like what you see a lot in older video games, where you kind of get this fake shadowy bumpness effect, like it kind of looks like it has some bump to it. And we could obviously come in here and affect our IOR, lower that down a little bit more, but it's still going to be totally flat. So it's the illusion of things like scratches, dinks, bumps. That's what the bump map shines for. But when you actually need it to like look like it's popping out of your object, that's when you need displacement. So, yeah, things like the classic example of like when you use bump maps as video games back in the day. Now you can use displacement a little more. But basically like Master Chief's helmet always had like scratches and cuts and things. Those weren't actually in the geometry. They were just faked with the bump map. What displacement does is it actually moves the geometry. And that leads us into how it works with Redshift. Because if you're coming from Octane, it's completely different. Octane is not geometry-based displacement. It's like pixel-based or something, which it is. I need to look more into it, but it sounds better. But basically, inside of Redshift, once you understand how to do it, it's actually incredible how it works. And if you've heard of Unreal Engine 5's Nanite and stuff, basically that's exactly what Redshift has. And it's pretty cool. So let's check it out. So in understanding displacement visually with the Redshift object tag, let's do it inside of C4D with the displacement modifier, because it works almost identically. The difference is the Redshift object tag with displacement actually has some extra things that make it work even better. So let's come here out of the IPR, and we see we have our material here. So maybe wondering like, how do I just make this not look like, just garbage? And that is to come in here and go to Edit, Preferences, go to Viewport Hardware. You'd think it'd be Viewport Display. It's actually not there. It's in the hardware. And this is where you can change the default resolution of textures. Right now they're 64-bit, so this is why this looks like Nintendo 64. Just up it to something like 512. Obviously, the more you add, the more it's going to make work on your machine. But it will, rebake your textures and stuff and bring them in. And so now we actually can see it looking pretty good. Now, if you have like a high-end machine or whatever, you can go 1K, 2K, whatever. And that's going to help bring that stuff in there as well. So that will help. Hopefully, I know a lot of people have issues with that. So it's a good little extra tip on there as well. And with this plane, we can hold shift and let go on the displacer. And inside the displacer, we can go to shading, shader, we can choose the bitmap, and we can actually just choose our displacement map right there. And it's going to displace that live. So now that we have that displaced, we can actually adjust the height of that. And you can see, obviously that's what it's going to look like. And that's because our plane is 10 by 10. So there's only 10 segments. So there's a couple ways we can do this. If you want, you can jack up the actual geometry of your object, and now you can start to see, okay, actually now I kind of see how it might actually look like pebbles and stuff. If I were to render this out, it might look a little cleaner. Yeah, it's starting to get there, right? We actually have some shadows and stuff cast, and it looks pretty good, but we don't have a ton of detail, which is fine. So, but that's kind of the base of how it works. The more geometry there is, the better it's going to look. So here is how we will do that. Let's go ahead and change this to be set to the shading and lines. So we can see that we have a lot more geometry here, whereas before we had 10 and 10. But obviously we don't want to really have every object have to be like 1,000 by 1,000, because it's going to bog down our scene when you have a bunch of things or a huge landscape that needs to be even more dense than that. Right? But if we were to have this be this detailed and we load this up, you're going to see that it is going to look way better. There we go. It's almost flawless, right? So now we actually have the rocks and stuff lifting off the ground. Really nice, right? And it affects, and the shadows are casting nicely, and we can see it actually, the actual geometry is affecting where the shadows are being cast and stuff. So that's the difference between the displacement and bump right off the bat, right? You can really tell that it looks like, I mean, the geometry is moved to where it needs to be. So that is how redshift displacement works. When the geometry is there, it lifts up. But you don't have to have that many segments in your object in order for that to work. And I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up, is because they don't really understand how the RS object tag works and what the tessellation feature is actually doing when we use it. So let's talk about how to do that. Okay, so we're going to keep it on the modifier for now, just for example, okay? Because what we want to do is we're going to take our plane and we're going to take it back down to 10 and 10. So we have our crappy low poly looking mesh. Now the way that the RS object tag works and the tessellation works is if we right click this, go to render tags, redshift object tag. Inside the geometry tab, there's a geometry override. And that's where we click that on. And then we have two options, displacement and tessellation. If we are to enable these right now, what you're going to notice is that when we render this, we're not going to see anything change in the viewport, and that can be confusing to people. Nothing is happening in the viewport. What this is doing is it's going to put all of the workload and all of the extra tessellation into render time, and I'll explain that better here in just a second visually. But if you notice, it doesn't look like that much better, and also it's curved our corners, and that's because it's acting like a subdivision surface, basically. So right off the bat, you know, the default settings aren't that impressive. They're kind of messing up our object. And yeah, you know, bending the corners might not be that big a deal on a ground plane, but let's say you're putting this on a wall or a model, and now all of a sudden your walls aren't touching and there's holes in your castle or something like that. So that's no good. So first off, why is this happening? So let's explain that. Rather than explaining how to fix it right off the bat, let's explain why it's happening. So we're going to just turn off the override here and go back into here. So what the RS tessellation tag is the equivalent of a subsurface division. So if we take our plane, we can go ahead and delete this tag just so we're all on the same page. We take this plane, we add a subsurface division, hold Alt and click that. You're going to notice that it looks almost exactly like it looked when we had the RS tessellation on, okay? And that is because the way that these work is they are set to smooth by default. So yeah, we're adding, you know, that geometry. Let's go ahead and turn this IPR off. We're getting more geometry. So when we don't have it, turn it on. You can see that geometry. Adding the RS object tag will not show you the wireframe in the viewport. And I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up. It's because this is working. This is what it's doing to it at render time. And so you might ask, well, why would you do that? Well, by putting that workload at render time versus in the viewport, it basically allows everything you're building, the whole process of creating, to go way faster. And it also applies the displacement at render time, which allows it to be faster. So it's just overall better for the entire project. The only issue is obviously when we displaced it inside of the viewport, you get to visually see it, you know, while it's there, and you can align models up and stuff a lot easier versus waiting for it to render to work. But now the IPR really works fast enough with displacement with the RS object tag that you can kind of work in the IPR for the most part anyway. But anyway, so let's talk about how to fix this curve and how to subdivide. So basically, you know, when we had it set to 1,000 by 1,000, what we want to do is, you know, click this up, and this is going to be subdividing it exponentially, right? So we go 4 and 4, but you may notice that that's kind of as far as the slider goes, and that's because once you start going past that, you can really start bogging down your system, and everything starts getting slower. So like when we had 1,000 by 1,000, we might be the equivalent of 5 and 5. And every time you go past 4, you're rolling the dice on whether you're going to freeze it. And this is just one object in our scene. Imagine having a bunch of objects that you need to put displacement on, like a bunch of high poly rocks and castle walls and roads, and then the ground with the leaves and stuff like that. So you can see how this starts stacking up exponentially. And so there's got to be somehow where you can cut the corner to save on performance, but still get the result of the quality. And that's what the RS tessellation tag is doing. It's doing this at render time so that it doesn't break C4D. That's the simplest way to put it. Now, if you start to put the tessellation tag on top of this, it's probably still going to break C4D because you're subdividing a subdivision and it's already really high poly, and so it might break it. There's a limit to as far as you can go, and the only way to really figure that out is to see what your computer can handle. Trial and error. So let's just, for the sake of understanding, kind of do the most common practice of what you can do, how to keep your shape, but have enough geometry that allows the tessellation tag to give you good results without, the risk of breaking your computer, right? Freezing it up. So first off, our corners are jacked. There's a couple ways you can fix this, but the easiest way to fix it is to, inside of this, not use the subdivision viewport because that is going to smooth it. Instead, actually just use the open sub div bilinear. Or, you can lower this down and use the linear pre-division, which is going to subdivide it before. So basically this should be at the top. They put linear pre-subdivision at the bottom, even though this effect goes before these effects. So visually that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But pre-subdivision means it's going to subdivide it using the bilinear method before it subdivides it with the Catmull-Clark method. Now the Catmull-Clark method has smoothing on by default. The linear means it's not going to smooth it. It's just going to draw straight lines and not smooth it. So with this, we're able to have, a very high poly shape without the expense of doing it. And we still have our original 10 by 10 undestructed, non-destructive way of building, right? So this is basically how we need to tell Redshift object tag to work, right? Or, and vice versa, is just grab this, say the open subdiv bilinear, and just use that. And that's going to be exactly the same way, right? So we want it to linearly subdivide everything, but we need more than this, and we don't want it to do it in the viewport. So the thing to keep in mind is this is what we're going to do without lagging out our scene. But right now, with the displacement modifier, this still isn't going to work. We actually need to take this, hit C to create it its own object. So it's one object cranked up like that, drag that on there now, and then put the displacement tag back on that. And again, we need to do the shading, bitmap, and then that displacement. So once we've made it an object, we're going to see we can actually just turn off the display here. Boop. And you can see we get that object in the viewport, and you can tell exactly how that's looking and how that's going to work. And you can tell that's what we want. That looks good, right? That's what we want, and that's what it's going to look like, but at render time. But we don't want to have to worry about this high poly mess of stuff. So how do we fix it? How do we do it? So that is what the RS object tag is going to turn our 10 by 10 plane into at render time. Hopefully that makes sense, right? But that's why you need the geometry. That's how the displacement works inside of Redshift. It works exactly like the displacement modifier. It's only going to give you that detail because we have the geometry there. Okay, so let's turn this off. We'll go back to our 10 by 10 plane. Here we go, the default plane. Put our material on there, and now we're going to right click, go to render tags, RS object tag, geometry, override, tessellation, and displacement. Okay, so in order for this to work, first things first is we need to turn off smooth subdivisions. Boom, that's it. Now we're basically using the bilinear method, so we don't have to worry about that. It won't smooth anything out. That's totally fine. You can still put a smoothing deformer on top of this or whatever. So later if you need to smooth it, but you normally won't have to. Okay. Then the next option is screen space adaptive. And basically what that is Redshift's nanite in a way. So the way this works is you have these minimum edge lengths and this maximum subdivision. So these are what determine how many times you're adding that subdivision that we did earlier inside of our plane. So we want a minimum edge length, and basically that says, okay, how many subdivisions do I need to add in order to get an edge length of 4? And it's like, okay, what is 4? It's hard to explain, but it's 4 units or 4 or whatever your units are. But really, here's what you need to know as far as like, there's not like a use this number every single time, there kind of is and kind of isn't. So if you're not sure what to do, type in 0. 0 is actually not going to break it, because you may think, okay, the lower the minimum edge length, the more subdivisions it will take to get to that small of a length, right? Okay. Now, if you set it to 0, you might think, well, that's going to be like an infinite amount of subdivisions. Actually, the way it works is it kind of sets it to automatic, and it will do whatever it thinks it needs to get the results that it thinks look pretty good, basically, right? So that's probably going to be your best bet. But if you do something really, really small, that's going to require a lot of subdivisions, and that's going to make things take longer. But they still will work better than the subdivision surface. Because you saw, like, after we subdivided it 5 times, okay, it started getting kind of laggy a little bit. You saw how dense it was. This has a max default of 6. So that's one more extra time than when we went past the max of 4, you know, the default settings of 4 inside of there. So you can get an idea of how this is working, right? So we're going to type in 0 right here. And the way back to the way the screen space adaptive works is basically exactly like Nanite. Nanite works in a way that's like, okay, it kind of senses, okay, if I'm close to the geometry right here, and it knows that there's a lot of detail in this part, it's going to use as much of the max subdivision as possible in this part, and it's going to know that this part back here is kind of maybe off screen, like the stuff on the plane that's off screen. It's going to know that that doesn't need the max subdivisions because we're not seeing it. So it's going to save memory by saying, okay, I'm only going to focus on what's on screen, as not focus on as much of what's off screen. So it may look a little crappier back off screen, but you're not going to see it because it's off screen. So it's not going to do the calculations for that until it comes on screen, just like Nanite kind of works, right? And when you're far away from the Nanite objects and stuff's off screen, you notice it's like the big triangles, and then when you get close, it's the little tiny triangles. That's exactly what this is doing. All right. So hopefully that explains kind of why you want that on. It's just going to help. Now, if you're, for whatever reason, you just want it to do everything everywhere, maybe you're modeling something you're going to export out, well, then you would just model it. Don't worry about the RS Tessellation tag. So, okay, so then we could say, how many max subdivides do we want to do? Well, let's just take a look at what 6 looks like here in, our 10 by 10, and we saw how well 5 looked. And so let's go ahead and just turn on the IPR and see what this looks like. You'll notice in the bottom left corner, it may say that it is thinking. It'll say forcing tessellation, that kind of thing. Okay, so now we have our tag set up with the edge length of 0 and subdivisions of 6, and we're ready to see how this is going to work. Well, we need to go back into our object, and we need to set up our displacement because we haven't done that yet, right? Because we're using the displacement modifier. So now in order to do that, all we have to do is hit C, type in displace, and drag that in, okay? And it's set to height field, that's good. We have a gray height map here. Drag that into there, and then that skips our material and goes straight into the output. So that goes right into the displacement here. Boom, purple dot to purple dot. Okay, now for now, we can leave this as it is, and that's fine. Okay, we can do what we need to do in here. And so that's good, one less thing to worry about. So what we can do now is if we render this out, start the IPR, you're gonna notice that maybe down here in the bottom left corner, it's going to say it's forcing the tessellation. All right, there it goes. And obviously, it's very little, but you can tell it's actually not totally flat. So let's crank that up. And we're going to crank it up here. And we're going to say displacement scale. And we want it to be, when we were doing the displacer here, we had to do it like 8. So let's do like 10 here. And you may notice it's going to look kind of weird. But down here in the bottom left, there it goes. And it looks kind of funny. It just kind of looks like flat again. So what's happened is the maximum displacement, we left it at 1. So if you're trying to displace everything in a way, basically you have a range from 0 to 1, where the gray value is right in the middle. Okay, and everything that's white is going to be pushed up higher, and everything that's black is going to be kind of sunk down. So if you multiply everything by 10, but then you use a max of 1, max is like the roof of the displacement. How far is your displacement allowed to lift off of the ground? So if you're telling everything to go 10 times higher, but the max is right here, it's just going to go and just hit the roof. And you're not going to see it. Okay, so we need to come in here and adjust our roof. And we'll say, okay, well, let's set the roof to 10. Now you see our displacement is actually working. Cool. Now let's do what, there's two things you could do now to kind of improve how this works. Because if we come in here and set a new plane, exactly in the same space, you're going to kind of see what's happening with our displacement. If you look at this from the side, you can see that our plane that's exactly in the same spot, 0, 0, 0, is actually completely lifted up off the ground. Everything's up. Nothing is going down. Everything's being pushed up. Just some things are getting pushed up more. So how do we fix that? Well, that is where you come in here to the material and the displacement node, and you want to set this range to -0.5 and then the max to 0.5. That way we're keeping that same ratio from black to white, but we're just going to shift the midpoint. This is exactly the same as setting the midpoint to 0.5, okay? And now you can see that that actually lines up with our other plane, and we just have half of it pushing up, half of it pushing down. So that's how you fix everything like lifting up too high. Just easily set that. And because we set it up that way, that basically means we can keep these values the same. You don't have to have a double displacement height, and I think that just helps kind of keep things how it is. So the only time that this really is going to become an issue is if your maximum displacement number is lower than your displacement scale, which is something you might want to do sometimes if you just want to clamp things up. I'm not really sure why, but maximum displacement of 20, now that we have it set to a minimum, we can really go all the way up to 50. And it's not going to hit the ceiling. It's just going to basically act like a magnifier. So now, because we've set our midpoint correctly, the best way to explain this is it's like an Unreal Engine 5 where you just basically, you have a multiplier amount of how much displacement, and that's what this is doing now. So we turn this back up to 100. It's going to be the same, okay? So the best way to explain this now is with this, you can see what's popping up and what's popping down, is if you come in here and we just start cranking up our max displacement, nothing's really going to happen, right? It shouldn't change because we're not actually changing our displacement scale. Now, if we lower this back down to 1 and we start increasing our displacement scale, we will start seeing changes happen. Boom. And you can kind of see how it's like kind of hitting a plateau, right? So we're still getting those areas that were definitely below the midpoint aren't getting amplified. But everything that was above that is getting amplified like to the max because it's hitting the max displacement value. So it's basically like a clamp. And this can be used to your advantage with certain shapes and things. But if you want it to be the real detail, basically what you want to do is you want to make sure that this is set up above your max displacement scale. So we'll say like 50. There we go. And now everything's allowed to go higher. And now we can just adjust the displacement scale and kind of just really focus in on the amplitude amplification of our displacement. So we'll say like 11. That's fine. Let's turn off this other plane just so we can see what it looks like. And you notice that, our textures are stretching and things, and doesn't look perfect. It's good. I mean, we still just have a 10 by 10 square. We don't have any extra geometry going on anywhere, but we're getting a lot of that detail. So now we just need to take our tessellation and up the max subdivisions here. So let's go ahead and just crank that up to 12. And we need to refresh because by default, the freeze tessellation is on. We just changed the tessellation, so we need to refresh that. Now it's going to take a little bit longer to cook because, I doubled the tessellation, and I didn't just double, doubling the tessellation is exponential. It's not just like, oh, just twice as much. It's 6 times as much tessellation, basically, because we were at 6, right? So here we are. Now we have this crazy high definition. Very, very good. But you can see it's still running very smooth. And in our viewport, we still just have a 10 by 10. So our actual viewport and everything working just as fast as ever. It's not like not bogging down our system. And once it cooks it the first time, it will log and freeze that in, which is nice. It allows us to work with it in real time. And we can still come in here, and because the tessellation is the same and frozen, we can still come in here and adjust on the fly. Crank it up. There you go. So now we've amplified it quite a bit, and you can tell, obviously if we were to rotate our sky a little bit more, you're really going to see that difference, obviously from the shadows and stuff from that. And this is still just a 10 by 10 plane, and that is kind of the beauty of Redshift. Now, obviously, we're exaggerating it more than we need to. We're getting that. But we are running very smooth. And if we were to come in here to our plane that we had originally, put a subdivision surface on that, put a 12 on that, and then have the displacer, like the 12 would be so many lines, it would freeze our scene, like putting it, then that's the power. And then hopefully that, okay, that's it. Like that's the simplest explanation of how the Redshift Tessellation tag works. It is a subdivision surface tag on your object. But yeah, so that is what the RS Tessellation tag is doing. You might think, oh, it's frozen. No, always check down here, forcing it at render time. Anytime you make a change to the tessellation or whatever, it's going to think. But there is a way to make this go even faster. Okay, and I'll show you that here in just a second. So, I mean, you can just tell I've replaced my lights here with the sunlight with an area light just to kind of demonstrate how it's working. And you can just see how good that is, right? Like that is something you don't get from the bump map. You don't get that level of detail from the bump map. And we're just looking straight down at it. And a couple things you can do is try to find that sweet spot for your object where you go back into our original object, maybe add some more segments in there if you can. You don't have to. You also can manually do it if it's editable by hitting, well, let's go ahead and hit C to make it so it's like, say it's an object or a wall or something you've brought in. Hit U, Shift S, and you can subdivide without smoothing it inside of here, okay? So you can do that 1 or 2 times first before using the Redshift object tag to maybe balance that performance at render time and in the viewport. You can always try that. But if you ever notice, let's try to bring this back up. If you ever notice anything like weird little lines, obviously some of the edges are, you're gonna have a little tearing when it comes to pushing it a little further than it needs to. Like on some of these in the distance here, like that, like right on the edge there, right? And if you notice, sometimes you can fix this a little bit with the enable auto bump mapping. And so it's like a little jagged. The auto bump mapping should help smooth that out somewhat. Now, we're not going to make this perfect until, we have so much geometry that we can make like a perfect circle kind of a thing, right? But you always want to find that balance. If you're trying to get this close into your object, you can, I guess, but you're going to push it. But you can see how that enable that auto bump mapping really fixed that out and made it a lot less obvious. So there is a time and a place for all of that. But again, you can just see like how good this looks and how well it works with the lighting and stuff and why you should use it sometimes. So the last question is, okay, how do I make this run like even faster? So you have an object, something like you've got this set up. All you need to do is come in here, and if you freeze the geometry, that's going to freeze the geometry across the whole scene. So basically, it's going to just only focus, it's not going to focus on tessellation. It's not going to focus on the geometry of your object or anything like that. It is purely going to focus on lighting and material and camera stuff at that point. So everything's going to go even faster now. But the difference is if we come in here and try to add like another plane, it's not going to do that because we told it to freeze the geometry. So it's like, nope, I'm not adding any more stuff. So keep that in mind. But it does help you just speed things up in the IPR. If you need to, you can always unfreeze it, add it, refreeze it, that kind of thing. So this is a really good way to figure out how it's displacing and thinking about like, is it displacing too much? Probably. These rocks probably don't, stick up and suck down that much. So All right, hopefully that explained kind of how Redshift Tessellation works, how Redshift Displacement works, and what the geometry does when it is there and why you need it. So you can apply this method to any object, shape, whatever, extrusion, whatever, and there's just different ways to apply that. The volume builder, remesher, all these things. And so there's not like a one set, this is all you need to do ever, and it's always gonna be fixed, because when you extrude things, the caps can be set to regular grid and stuff like that. Like there's always, circumstances and things. But let me know in the comments below if you have any other pain points with Redshift, stuff like this. I love kind of hopefully explaining things through in a way. And if you like this kind of like explaining in a practical, tangible sort of visual way, you'll definitely love the Mind in Motion workshop, which is still on sale for 150 bucks, which is $500 value for 150 bucks. It's 100 plus videos like this where you make something cool.